We're going to start before I turn the program over to our speakers. I want to introduce them. First is Tracy Bradford. She has worked in the Army Museum Enterprise for over 10 years. She's currently the curator at the United States Army Women's Museum at Fort Lee in Petersburg, Virginia. Prior to this, Tracy spent 3 years as a museum educator in the Programs and Education Department at the National Museum of the U.S. Army. She's an educator and interpreter for 25 years. Tracy has taught in secondary education, private industry, the federal government, and historical institutions across the country. So then we're going to tell you all about Jennifer Dabina. Jen is a museum educator at the National Army Museum, where she focuses on developing content for educators and students. Prior to joining the museum, she worked at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial, and Sagamore Hill National Historic Site on Long Island, New York. She earned a Master of Arts degree in Public History from American University. So welcome, Tracy and Jen. We're glad you're with us, and I'm going to go ahead and turn over the program.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hopefully all of you can hear me. Tonight, thank you also, John, for that great introduction. Tonight, Tracy and I will be talking about the Hello Girls, the female telephone operators who served the American Expeditionary Forces as telephone operators during World War I. And specifically, we are going to be tracing the journeys of these three women before, during, and after the war to shed light on the commitments, challenges, and sacrifices of the first women to serve in a role other than nurse on or near the front lines. But before we get started, I wanted to build a small bit of context for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the Hello Girls. Who were the Hello Girls? What was their role? And how did the Army decide to recruit women to work switchboards overseas? Today, the telephone is pretty ubiquitous. Who doesn't have a telephone or a smartphone? But a little more than 100 years ago, the telephone was a fairly new invention that was owned by a small number of people. Unlike today's telephones, which use radio waves, early telephones used sound waves, traveling by wires to connect calls. And those wires met at a central exchange or a switchboard. And it was at that switchboard that it was manned by a telephone operator who was manually connecting wires to route calls. And while it was a male-dominated field in the beginning when telephones were first invented, women pretty quickly began to replace men as operators, and telephone companies switched to female operators since they were cheaper to hire and considered more patient, docile, and agreeable than boys. So by 1917 and the beginning of America's entry into World War I, 99% of telephone operators in the United States were women. And not only did the telephone transform civilian life at home and in the workplace, but it also impacted the Army. So it's no surprise in 1917 when the first units that are sent to France are telephone battalions. And these Bell battalions were comprised of soldiers who had previously worked for Bell telephone companies. And the soldiers deployed to France with the mission to set up telephone lines, switchboards, and exchanges. However, once the lines and the switchboards were operational in France, the Army realized that they lacked competent switchboard operators. Most soldiers had never worked a switchboard before deploying overseas, even though they might have worked with the machinery before, they might have set lines up before, they were completely unfamiliar with the actual task of connecting one call to another. And so this gendered aspect of telephone operating meant those men really they didn't have any idea how the switchboard worked. And so these problems led General John J. Pershing, commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, to request the organization and dispatch to France of a force of women telephone operators, all speaking French and English equally well. And that request created the Army's first all-female telephone operator unit. And so between March and October of 1918, 223 women were sent to France to operate the military switchboard system. The operators were stationed at almost every major army telephone exchange in France. And the operators encompassed a wide range of military units, from supply centers at Bordeaux and Le Havre to the men fighting in the trenches. Beyond their basic duties, the operators were also sometimes called upon to relay orders from commanders to troops. They served as translators during calls to French units, and they worked the lines in search of a path around battle-damaged wires. They were well within artillery range, and they operated with their gas mask handy. In all, the AEF hired 377 women, 223 of whom would actually be deployed to France. And tonight, Tracy and I are going to look at 3 of those women specifically to learn more about their experiences and fill in some of the gaps on what these operators did. And so the first operator that we are going to look at is Merle Egan Anderson. So Merle Egan was born in 1888 in Smith Center, Kansas, in a small town. It's in northern Kansas. Smith Center's claim to fame is a poem that would later be put to music as Home on the Range. And that was written in a small cabin 9 miles north of her hometown just before her birth. So perhaps that song can give you an idea about her birth and where she lived. Skies that are not cloudy all day, where deer and antelope play, and where breezes are balmy and light. In 1906, at the age of 18, Egan begins her career as a telephone operator at the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver, Colorado. This opulent hotel was constructed in 1892 by Henry Cords Brown, who was a carpenter turned real estate entrepreneur. When the building was complete, there were many architectural stories published about the hotel at the time. It was also the tallest building in Denver, and some of the notable guests included Colorado celebrities like the unsinkable Molly Brown. And the image on your screen is a picture of that hotel from 1902. And so comparing just the size of the building with the picture that I painted to you earlier about Smith Center, where Merle was born, I can only imagine that this environment would have been very different from the one that she grew up in. She definitely wasn't in Kansas anymore. At some point, Egan moves to Montana to work at the Montana States Telephone and Telegraph Company. And in that position, she was promoted to the role of telephone traffic supervisor. And that job required her to travel from town to town in Montana to be what was called a traffic troubleshooter. And her job was to really improve telephone service by instructing chief operators and just regular operators on how to connect calls, how to troubleshoot problems that they might have. And as a result, she considered herself to be fairly familiar with all telephone switchboard operations. And the image I have on your screen is an image of the Montana States Telephone and Telegraph Building in Miles City, Montana, which, if you're familiar with Montana, it's quite far from Helena, but Egan visited many sites throughout the state. So perhaps during her time with this company, she actually visited this area. In 1917, in March, when General Pershing made his request for a force of women telephone operators, this really kicked off the Army's recruitment for operators. And so ads were published in newspapers, and information was sent to telephone companies to spread the word so they could find these operators that were desperately needed in France to help aid in communication. Egan had learned about the opportunity in March when they first reported it, but she initially didn't apply for the position because she didn't speak French. And as you might be able to read from the advertisement on your screen, which is an example of that, one of the key requirements in the beginning was that these women had to speak equally well both French and English. However, As American telephone networks expanded in France, Pershing requested more operators to operate the switchboards. And to find those operators, those stringent requirements for language fluency were relaxed. And so as soon as those requirements were changed, Egan immediately volunteered for service. And in July 1918, she was inducted into the Army. And so, by her own account, years later, in an affidavit, she wrote that she was sworn into military service by General Greenan of the Montana National Guard. And after she was sworn in, the War Department issued orders to Egan that would send her to New York City to join what was to become Unit Number 5 of the telephone operators. And the Army provided quarters at the Prince George Hotel, which I have pictured on your screen. And this elegant hotel was considered to be one of New York City's most modern and lavish hotels. It boasted its own private bathroom in each room. And specifically, the image I have on your screen is the main lounge, which was a 5,000 square foot room with arched ceilings and Renaissance style murals, which pretty nice accommodations for the Army when they're paying for it and they're sending you there. And so I can only imagine how exciting that might have been for Egan and the other women who were reporting for duty in Unit Number 5. And so while she was in New York City, Egan trained at the Bell Telephone Company headquarters. And in addition to training, she was fitted for her uniform and equipment, as well as inoculated and vaccinated. Unit Number 5 was sworn into service by Mr. Darling, who was an employee of the telephone company. And Egan remembered that he told the unit, "I have orders from the Army to swear you into the Army. Hold up your hands." So you get an idea just by what's happening for Egan that she very much considers herself to be in the Army at that time. By her own account, this is the second time she feels that she is being sworn into the Army. And like soldiers, she and her Unit Number 5 departed from the Hudson River docks in New York City on August 5th, 1918 on the SS Aquitania. The troop ship carried 7,000 enlisted men, 200 officers, and 30 Signal Corps women who made up Unit Number 5. And the image on your screen is titled Officer Sailing on the Ship, and it lists the second lieutenants and the civilians aboard the ship. And interesting, on this manifest, Egan is listed under the civilian column, along with all of the other women within the telephone unit. So you can just see here in the primary source documents that kind of give and take between what are these, or what's the classification for these operators. On the one hand, they're very much treated like they're soldiers receiving uniforms, taking oaths. But on the other hand, in documents that the Army is producing for transporting them, they are clearly listed as civilians. On August 12th, 1918, Unit Number 5 arrives in Liverpool, and they immediately boarded ships for Southampton. Egan did not join the unit once they arrived in Southampton, and was rather sent to an American Army hospital to treat an infected toe. She was quartered with Army nurses stationed at the hospital while receiving treatment, and Egan recalled that her infected toe was caused by her ill-fitting Army shoes. After her discharge from the hospital, Egan was ordered to duty with the Service of Supplies at Tours. Her previous telephone experience in Montana prepared her for her service. Egan was chosen for a special assignment to train soldiers on how to use frontline switchboards used by field signal battalions. Egan recalled that the men were initially hesitant to receive instruction from a woman. Later, she recalled, invariably they asked, "Where are our skirts?" When I explained that any officer could carry a gun, while the safety of whole regiments might depend on their switchboard, I soon had willing pupils. And while on tour, Unit Number 5 was quartered at the La Centra Hotel, and the image on your screen is a group of telephone operators from Unit Number 5 in front of Barracks Number 66, which was the headquarters in tour and where the women were stationed. They are not identified in the image from the National Archives, but based on looking at pictures of Merle Egan, I believe she is in the front right, actually, I think she's this one right here in the front. And so on November 13th, 1918, 2 days after the armistice, Egan was assigned to be the chief operator for the American legation to the Paris Peace Conference. And in this role, she served President Wilson and all members of the American Peace Commission through a switchboard at the Hotel Crayon. While in Paris, hotel facilities for the unit were at a different hotel. And while on duty there, she was issued and wore the insignia authorized for the American Peace Commission personnel. Of the assignment, Egan would later state, even now, after more than 50 years, it seems incredible that a young woman from a small city in Montana would rate an assignment that would involve telephone service to not only the outstanding men of our country, but the world. After the Treaty of Versailles was signed, Egan requested to be discharged. And so on May 20th, 1919, less than a year after she left home, Egan returned aboard the Graf Walder See. And upon her arrival in New York, the Army issued her travel orders to return to Helena, Montana. And the image on your screen that's really impossible to read is the passenger ship for her return journey. And again, this also lists her under civilians. And she's listed as a civilian employee along with her emergency contact, which was her mother at the time, who was living in Seattle. Egan returned to Montana and she married H.R. Anderson, who was an employee of the Montana State's Telephone and Telegraph Company. And she recalled that her new husband was very proud of my service and wrote one day to the Army to obtain my victory medal. We were astonished to receive the Army's reply that I was actually a civilian employee. This, I believe, was my first indication that my former military status was in question. This was an even greater shock since I had just weeks earlier received a citation from General Pershing for my service. In 1928, the family would move to Seattle, Washington, and that's where she learned that female yeomen who had served with the Navy had been given veteran status. And this marked a turning point for Egan. From that point forward, she dedicated herself to obtaining military status for the Signal Corps telephone operators. She joined the Women's Overseas Service League, and she served on a committee to pass a congressional bill to grant the operators service. And she continued this fight for many years. Attorney Mark Hugh learned about the Hello Girls after reading an article in the Seattle Times featuring an interview with Egan, and Hugh volunteered his expertise and investigated the case, and he testified before the Senate Armed Services, or the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. And his testimony included sworn statements by many of the telephone operators, but including Egan. So her words and her testimony helped to spur change. And almost 60 years later, following the World War I armistice, President Carter signed a bill conferring veteran status to the Hello Girls. The bill was influenced in large part by statements from the operators themselves. In 1979, at the age of 91, Anderson received her discharge papers in a ceremony at Fort Lawton, Washington. And in 1986, Merle Egan died in Seattle, Washington at the age of 94 and a U.S. Army veteran. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy to look at another Hello Girl.
I would just like to start by thanking Jen and her amazing team for putting together this storyboard, which I have to confess, it was a little beyond my technical prowess. So shout out to them all. So we are going to head back to France to begin the story of Marie-Louise Ruffe. So let's go ahead, Jen, and move on to Marie-Louise Ruffe, who went by Louise, was a Hello Girl whose archival collection is housed at the U.S. Army Women's Museum. So this is a robust collection which contains over 100 documents and photographs that capture her life's experiences. And a great many of these are from her time as a Hello Girl. So most of the personal photographs and paperwork that you're going to see in the storyboard are actually housed at the Army Women's Museum. And I'm going to apologize here ahead of time for my French pronunciation of some of the names I'm getting ready to talk about. So Ruth was born on January 4th of 1892 in the town of Celis-de-Salat, France. And she was the daughter of Mathieu Alphonse and Jean-Marie Ruffe. And we do know that she had at least two sisters, Victorine and Pauline. Now, technically, this is Louise Ruffe's story that I'm sharing with you tonight, but you will see her sister Pauline periodically appear throughout the presentation. So at the age of 20, Louise and her sister Pauline, who was 17 at the time, sailed from Le Havre to the United States. And the siblings traveled, we know, in second class aboard the SS France, and they arrived at Ellis Island on the 17th of October, 1912. And so here you can see Louise's certificate of arrival. In the next slide. And this is from the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Naturalization. And it says that this is to certify that the following named alien arrived in the United States on the date and in the manner described below at Ellis Island, New York. So luckily for us, she kept a lot of her documents. So after arriving in New York, Louise and Pauline made their way across the country to live with their uncle on a ranch in San Mateo, California. So the sisters are pictured here with Louise on the right wearing the lace collar and Pauline's on the left in the fur stole. So Louise eventually moved to San Francisco where she worked as a milliner. And then Pauline got married in 1915 to a man named Joseph McDonald. So when that call went out that Jen mentioned from General Pershing's AEF for volunteers to serve as telephone operators in France, both Louise and Pauline answered the call, decided to use their bilingual skills, and they volunteered for service. So by February 1918, Ruffe had received a letter from the War Department in which the chief signal officer appointed her as an operator in the telephone unit. So this document here indicates that she was to be paid $60 a month with allowances of rations, quarters, and medical attendance accorded Army nurses by Army regulation. So this appointment directed then that after Louise completed her preliminary course for telephone operators, she would report for assignment. So Louise, previously had not had any experience with telephone operations. So she was selected because of her language skills. So later that spring, Ruffe received a physical exam and a series of vaccinations. And in preparation for her eventual deployment, she reported for duty. So she and colleagues from the Pacific Telephone and Telegraph Company were assigned to the 4th unit of the Signal Corps telephone operators. And so this is the class, the group right before Merle Egan. You can see some of them here in a photograph that was published in the Pacific Telephone magazine. And that was a monthly magazine put out for company employees. So Louise is in the front row, second from the right. Now, Pauline is not in this photo, but she is included in a different photograph in the same magazine. So I can assume that she received her training at or about the same time as her sister. So in June of 1918, Ruffe received orders to report to New York City. And in New York, she was issued this certificate of identity. And although she was a civilian employee of the Army, the form stated that she was entitled under the laws of war to the privileges, if captured, to the privileges of a prisoner of war. So if you look at this document here and you look down to the third line, so first you see her name written in there, Louise Ruffe, and then her assignment, telephone operator, you can see the sentence that begins with "he is entitled." And an S had to be written in to indicate that Louise was a woman. So all of the military paperwork at this time, of course, only was used for men. So it's in New York that Louise buys her uniform with her own funds. The women had to purchase their own uniforms with their own money. So her instructions indicated, and this is a copy of the instructions here, that she go to some familiar places to us today. So she went to Lord and Taylor on Fifth Avenue for her underwear and miscellaneous dry goods. She went to the Goodyear Rubber Company on Broadway for raincoats and hot water bags. She went to Abercrombie and Fitch on Madison Avenue for Signal Corps insignia, and then Weltman and Pollock on 35th Street, Fifth Streets for her uniform. So we actually just recently put Ruffe's uniform on display. It's going to be pictured here at the Army Women's Museum. So it has a dark blue serge blouse with a stand and fall collar. So the women had the option to wear the blouse open with a false white collar or buttoned up. So in the different pictures, you can see them choosing to wear it in different styles. The US and the Signal Corps insignia were worn on the opposite collars. And even though we do have her purchase instructions, interestingly, there is not a maker's tag in this uniform. So we can't say exactly where she bought it. She was instructed to go to Weltman and Pollock, but we can't say for sure. Her uniform, though, does have an embroidered name tag with a faded handwritten laundry number in the nape of the collar. We also own her summer uniform, which was a beautiful blue raw silk. So Ruffe and her friends did manage to have a little fun sightseeing while they were in New York, and they were looking sharp here in this photo in their new uniforms when they went to visit Coney Island. So some Hello Girls wore blue serge garrison caps, as Louise is wearing in this photo. She's in the middle. But another option was to wear dark blue fedoras with orange and white cord ribbons. You can also see the women are wearing brassards in this photo. So in a March 29th, 1918 Stars and Stripes newspaper article, the ranks of the Hello Girls displayed on their armbands were identified. So an operator first class wore the white armband with an outlined blue telephone mouthpiece. A supervisor who rated as a platoon sergeant wore the same armband with a wreath around the mouthpiece. And then a chief operator or top had the emblem with the mouthpiece, the wreath, and blue lightning flashes shooting out from above the receiver. So later on, the brassard would be replaced by patches sewn into the sleeve. So once again, in some of the images, you'll see they're not wearing the brassard. So shortly before they departed for France, this photo of the 4th unit of telephone operators was taken on the roof of 195 Broadway in New York, which was the AT&T building. And this photo was taken on the 13th of June, 1918. And guess what? Pauline is back. So Louise is in the front row. She's the 6th from the right. I don't know, Jen, can you circle her with your, there you go, awesome. And then Louise, or Pauline, is behind her, one person to the left. So the sisters are back together in this photograph and getting ready to go back to France. So they sailed on a different ship. Louise and Pauline set sail aboard the Lapland. And while en route, interestingly, Louise had fellow passengers sign a souvenir postcard. So many of the people on the ship were American Expeditionary Forces medical personnel who were headed to base hospital number 25. So in the background here of this photo, you can see their signatures, and a lot of them say base hospital number 25. We have photographs that Louise actually took on the ship, but you know that many of the photographs from this time period are just these little bitty tiny, almost postage stamp size photographs. So they don't blow up well for presentations like this, but it is interesting to see her on the ship. So once in France, Ruffe was issued a worker's permit, which is this red document here, and she was stationed in Bordeaux. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information about her assignment. So Ruffe kept so much memorabilia, but the majority of it are hotel receipts, theater programs, train tickets, schedules, etc. But we do have her operator's manual and we do have some of her military documents, but we don't really have a clear picture of her day-to-day work. She didn't keep handwritten records about what she was actually doing and what work was like. Her collection has a very lovely travel feel to it. But while abroad, we do know that Ruffe received many passes to travel to other locations in France, and she had a number of traveling companions. So in this document, which is dated December 20th, 1918, interesting, she and Pauline were given permission to visit Celise de Salat, where they still had family. So this is right before the Christmas holiday where they were able to go home and see their French relatives. So at the end of her assignment, a little over a year later, Louise returned aboard the Agamemnon. And then after the war, Louise returned to San Francisco and her career as a milliner. So she did not continue to work as a telephone operator. She became a citizen of the United States in 1928. So Pauline's story has been a little more difficult to follow. So she pops up, as you can see, once in a while in photographs. But we do know that her husband, Joseph McDonnell, in 1938, was writing to his congressman advocating for that legislation that would have the telephone operators recognized as veterans. And so this document here is a letter back to Joseph from Representative Albert Carter of the 6th District in California. So as Jim mentioned, this was going to be a really long, hard-fought battle to have these women recognized as veterans. So Louise's story ends with her also working hard to have the women recognized for veteran status. But sadly, Louise died 2 years before that dream was realized. So she never actually saw herself recognized as a veteran.
All right, and so I'm going to conclude tonight with talking about Grace Banker, who Tracy and I joked about today is maybe one of the more famous of the women who went overseas. She's quoted a lot in different books and articles when talking about the Hello Girls and their service. So we thought this would be a nice way to end, to fill into the gaps of knowledge about some person that you may have heard of in the past if you have familiarity with the Hello Girls. But Grace Banker was born in Passaic, New Jersey, to William and Edith Banker on October 25th, 1882. In 1911, Banker attended Barnard College, where she studied French and history. And in addition to her studies, she was elected to be the treasurer of the church club. And she was active in the club's plays, and she won the part of the first prophet in the Christmas play. And she also scored the role of the Right Honorable Henry Carleton, MP, in His Excellency the Governor. Following her graduation from Barnard, Banker took a job at the American Telephone and Telegraphy, AT&T company in New York City. And there she advanced through the ranks, moving from being an operator to becoming an instructor in the long distance division. And this position gave her experience leading and instructing other operators. And while she had that job, she lived with her parents in Passaic. And so she would commute back and forth from New Jersey to New York City for work. And the photograph on your screen is a photograph of the AT&T headquarters where she worked. On December 5th, 1917, Banker read an advertisement in the Sunday New York Globe seeking recruits for telephone service in France. The advertisement was in response to that request that both Tracy and I have talked about for telephone operators to work in France. And 4 days later, she applied for the position, and she wrote to the chief signal officer of the Army, "I understand both French and English and have a thorough knowledge of the telephone." At the time, Banker's brother was also serving overseas in the 77th Field Artillery Division. And so her brother's service may point towards her own aspirations for service, patriotism, and doing her part for the war effort. In her application file, her supervisor at AT&T wrote, "Ms. Banker has been a member of the instructor department at AT&T for the past 2 years. I should be sorry for her loss." Banker was selected as the chief operator for Unit Number 1, which was attached to the U.S. First Army. She completed her training. She was fingerprinted and inoculated in New York City. And while training, her unit was quartered at River Street in Hoboken, New Jersey. And of the experience, she recalled, it was a cold and cheerless spot. We showered and resorted to setting up exercises in the morning to keep warm. Meals were eaten in a funny little restaurant around the corner. So her experience is very different from Merle Egan. She's not staying at a 5-star hotel, and she is staying someplace where she's very cold and has to exercise to stay warm. In an article published years later, Banker recalled of her unit that first group of Signal Corps girls had come from all over the United States and from Canada. Some, like myself, were college girls. Some came from public schools and some from private schools. All spoke French, but almost none had had any telephone experience until they were trained for overseas service by the telephone company. Their ages ranged from 19 to 35. There was only one of the latter. So she gives you an idea about who actually made up Unit Number 1. And on March 6, 1918, that first unit of 33 operators set sail aboard the troop transport ship, the Celtic. And of the journey, Banker wrote, "After 2 months of preparation in the USA, I've crossed the Rubicon now, and there can be no turning back." 12 days later, the ship docked in England, and their journey was an eventful one. Banker described it as 12 days of lifeboat drills, 3 days of obeying orders and sleeping in our clothes, stuck on a sandbar at the harbor of the Mersey River, just outside Liverpool, a target for German submarines, all one moonlit night. The unit spent a week in Southampton before being ferried to Le Havre, and once in France, Unit Number 1 was divided into 3 groups. Banker's group was assigned to the headquarters of the advanced section at Chaumont. Banker described her office as a stone military barracks, and it was also served as the headquarters for General John J. Pershing, and on your screen, you can see an image of what those headquarters looked like. The telephone was housed in a small room on the first floor. Banker's unit was quartered in a pleasant stone house on the Rue Burleigh near the edge of town. And Banker recalled, strange to say, it was more or less modern and boasted one of the few bathtubs in Chaumont. And at this duty station, Pershing actually inspected the unit's barracks. And Banker remarked that he never missed a thing and made sure to inspect every room, including the kitchen. And in an article published years later in the 70s, Banker remarked that when some of us saluted the general as he passed by, he remarked to someone else he was with, "Those girls are real soldiers." And so the image on your screen here gives you an idea of the Hello Girls and their off time in the passing their time when they aren't working. So Banker and the 3 other operators who were with the First Army moved with the headquarters in France and I'm going to butcher all of these French pronunciations, I should just say it right now. They moved with the French headquarters to Lignon-Barrois. There they served with 2 other operators who were there for a total of 5, and the telephone room was stationed in a little house on Main Street with sandbags piled high on the outside, which gave it a warlike appearance. Of the work, Banker recalled, the work was fascinating. Much of it was in codes that changed frequently, so the operators needed to be ready for anything. Of the accommodations, she wrote, home was very French and unpretentious. One entered a dark, narrow passageway off the main street. It led to a tiny paved courtyard, and my room was over the barn in the rear. So perhaps the image on your screen shows a little bit of what her room might have looked like. In September About 3 months later, the Army headquarters moved to the Army Adrian Barracks in Sully, 7 miles from the front lines, and Banker moved along with the headquarters. She described her accommodations there as ancient wood sheds that looked dilapidated enough. The barrack roofs leaked, and the temperature became so cold that ice formed in her water pails. The work was exhausting, and Banker recalled that she tumbled into bed at night. The operator's office was located in the center of number 8 barracks, and it only had 2 switchboards but maintained 24-hour service. The work was intense and the codes changed frequently. And it was here that a fire broke out in the barracks. The telephone operators initially refused to leave their post, and after the flames were extinguished, they restored telephone service within a few hours. The image on your screen is from the National Archives, and it's titled "The Barracks Used by Sleeping Quarters by the Signal Corps Telephone Girls in France." I'm not sure who lived there, but it reminds me of the ancient wooded sheds that Banker had previously described as the places where she was living. Banker received orders to travel to the Dun-sur-Meuse. However, those orders were countermanded 3 days later on the November 11th armistice when the end to fighting went into effect. Banker was on duty the night that the agreement was signed, and she recalled that all of the French boys from their office beyond came into the office and in French declared, "I could jump up and hit the ceiling," expressing their joy. Grace requested leave and started out for Nice, but was called back for another assignment. She wanted to take a break after 3 months of continuous work, after working for 3 months of 12 to 20 hours each day. And the group of operators on your screen is a group of telephone operators in Paris, and Grace is seen standing in the back on the left. So rather than Nice, Banker was assigned to the temporary residence of President Wilson. But after the excitement of working on the front line, she found the work to be, in her words, not particularly exciting. And so she requested a transfer to the Army of Occupation at Koblenz, Germany. And in Germany, Banker received the Distinguished Service Medal. And the medal was presented to her by Lieutenant General Liggett at Army headquarters. And her citation reads, "She served with exceptional ability as chief operator in the Signal Corps Exchange at General Headquarters, American Expeditionary Forces, and later in a similar capacity at First Army Headquarters. But by untiring devotion to her exacting duties under trying conditions, she did much to assure the success of the telephone service during the operations of the First Army against the St. Mihiel salient and to the north of Verdun." Of the medal, Banker recounted, "Whatever glory may go with the medal, I have always felt belongs in large measure to the very small but very loyal and devoted group of First Army girls: Suzanne Prevost, Bertha Hunt, Adele Hoppick, Esther Freshnell, Helen Hill, and Marie Lang." Banker was discharged in 1919, and she returned to the United States on the transport ship, the USS Mobile, on August 24th, 1919, and they docked right back where they started from in Hoboken, New Jersey on September 3rd. The document on your screen is the passenger list, which, like Merle's, it lists Banker as a civilian. And it also lists her emergency contact as her mother, and her mother was living at her childhood home in New Jersey at the time. Banker married Eugene Herman Paddock on March 4th, 1922 at St. John's Episcopal Church. Paddock was a civil engineer who had graduated from Columbia University in 1915, and the image on your screen is the couple's wedding announcement. And I love that it leads with Banker, winner of War Medal, weds and leads with her as the former head of the Signal Corps Girls of the Army. Banker and her husband moved to Scarsdale, New York, and they had 4 children. Like Louise, Banker did not live to see the Hello Girls receive veteran status. She died from cancer on December 17th, 1960 at the age of 68. She is buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. And it wouldn't be for 17 more years until Congress finally enacted the legislation to give the Hello Girls their veteran status. And by that time, as mentioned earlier, only 18 of the original 223 women who served overseas were still living. So that brings us to the end of Banker's story. And hopefully by hearing all three of these women's service stories from their time overseas, but also before and following their service, you're able to gain a better appreciation of the sacrifices, the service, and commitments and challenges of all of the Hello Girls, whether they deployed overseas or just trained over in the United States beforehand. I think we have time for questions if there are any from the audience.
Okay, Jen and Tracy, thank you very much for your presentation. We also appreciate the support from the Army Women's Museum. Tracy, your time and effort, and thanks not only for an interesting subject, but also for a well-presented subject. So thanks very much. We do have a couple of questions. One of them, I guess, is an overarching question about the program in general is, how do you pick the subjects of these battle briefs or other programs that you're involved with?
Do you want to answer for the battle briefs?
Well, I will. We try to get a wide variety of programs and different subjects that have proven to be well attended and interesting to people. So I assume, Jen, that's probably what you try to do also. But Tracy, yes. What kind of programs do you do with the Women's Museum, and how do you go about developing them?
Well, so this presentation in March, March is really our most busy month, but we like to say at the Army Women's Museum, we celebrate women's history 365 days a year. So basically a topical depending on, what's requested, because of course, Army Women's history spans from 1775 to the present. So depending on, what's current at the time. Right now, we are working on an exhibit for the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion. So you might have heard that Fort Lee is getting a new name. We're going to be redesignated at the end of April. And the name is going to be Fort Gregg Adams. And that is for Lieutenant General Arthur Gregg, who is a storied quartermaster. He's actually the only person on the renaming list. There are 9 installations that are getting new names. He's the only person that's still alive. So that's very unique. And the second part is for Adams, which is Charity Adams, Lieutenant Colonel Charity Adams, the commander of the 6888 Postal Battalion. So it's really exciting. There's a swell of interest. I think somebody had put in the chat about the Hello Girls getting a congressional gold medal, potentially. I know that movement is afoot. The women of the 6888, the only unit of Black women to go overseas, received a congressional gold medal last year. So, it takes a lot of civilian dedication to get something like that awarded. So let's hope that happens for the Hello Girls.
Thank you. Here's another question we have. Carter signed was it a proclamation or executive order? But who was behind that effort to bring it to a point where they were able to successfully get that enacted?
That's a great question, but is totally escaping me. It was, Tracy, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
I want to say Mark Howe, was he the lawyer?
He was the lawyer. I believe it was actually a congressional act, and that went through the House and Senate and then was signed by Carter. but I do not remember exactly who the legislators behind it were.
Okay. And you focused on 3 individuals here. Are there other women who serve that also have a lot of records and memorabilia and souvenirs that are also available to people to see and look at and research?
I can do a plug for there or many. Well, there's 223. I can do a plug for another Hello Girl who's actually on display at the National Army Museum. We have her uniform, Cordelia Dupuy. Unfortunately, her records are much harder to find, which is why, as much as I wanted to highlight her, like so many people in the past, their stories are just lost and hard to fill in the gaps. But our website does have a bio that fills in a little bit more about her service. She was bilingual. Originally, her parents were from Canada, which is how she knew French. And she also served overseas in the first unit with Grace Banker.
So I'll just add on to that. Interestingly, sometimes the way that collections are passed to museums, they get separated or they get, scattered. So we've had Louise Ruffe's archival collection for decades, but her uniform went to the Signal Corps Museum at Fort Gordon, Georgia. And so that was interesting because it got separated. So recently we were able to obtain it, but the 2 pieces, when they were not together, you might have missed a whole bunch of the story.
Sure. Thank you. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to read this question to you. With the very late recognition of the Hello Girls veteran status, were their relatives able to get the victory medals that they earned?
Do you want me to take it or do you want Tracy?
That's a very good question. I don't know, but I would assume that those medals would have gone to the families. Absolutely. I do know that with the medals, you can purchase, replicas that are smaller, but I would think that the families would have had access to that. These are hard questions, y'all.
Well, we've got another one about Louisa. Could it be that Louise didn't keep a diary because they were forbidden from doing so?
Possibly. I mean, I know a lot, some of the records that people have written, a lot of the records were from letters back and forth to the sisters. So interestingly, there were a couple of sets of sisters who actually went over as Hello Girls. So the Hopbach sisters, we have their records because they wrote each other. So, but since Louise and Pauline were there, there's really very little in her own hand that's in her collection. Yeah, they weren't supposed to take any civilian clothes with them either when they went overseas. That was in her orders. They were supposed to leave all of their civilian clothes back in the United States. Yeah.
That's interesting. Another question we have here, hand delivered to me, by the way. Did these women veterans, did their kids get any kind of like VA benefits or college benefits after they were declared to be Army veterans?
I haven't come across that, so I don't, unless Tracy, you've heard differently.
No, and like Louise never got married and never had kids. So, the only family record that we had, we lost track of Pauline. So no, I'd never heard of that.
Okay, well, I want to thank you both again for a wonderful program, well presented, very interesting presentation, and looks like a lot of hard work went into that. So thank you both to Tracy and Jen.